Election day. People are on edge in the streets, in the plazas, in their homes. Security is tight and en masse. Someone suspects their neighbor gave their vote for the other party. By the end of the day, they might find themselves mugged in an alleyway or worse. To be timid in your opinions is both survival and death. This is a nation on the cusp of imploding. This was the rapidly dissolving Second Republic of Spain, being pulled apart at the strings, pulled by its own citizens. The unfretting had gradually occurred over the centuries. Other countries expanded and prospered at the expense of the Spanish. When 16-year-old King Alfonso XIII takes the throne, the nation was still recuperating from the loss of the Caribbean and the Philippine Islands. As the remainder of the world seemed to flourish economically, old traditions of a powerful church and large estates dominated Spanish life. Opposition to the monarchy began to pop up, particularly in the northeast and Catalonia. The revolts were dealt with by swift police and militant forces. To quell the chaos, a military dictatorship was allowed to take over in 1923, but by the start of the next decade, that dictatorship had collapsed from unpopularity from all factions, and the king was forced to abdicate. Now a power struggle took hold in Spain. The Republic favored the ambitions of the liberal-leaning policies popular among the poorer classes. Those still with remaining values on the conservative end began to tighten their ranks. The Catholic Church was seen as a symbol of the old monarchist ways and became stripped of much of its power by the Republic. With cathedrals still standing, socialist mobs took matters in their own hands to destroy what remained. The Republic did nothing. Out of fear of the violence, conservatives began adopting elements of fascism and formed groups such as the Confederación Española de Treacherous. Nationalists saw communism as the absolute problem in Spain, and mobs began attacking anyone believing in support of the unions. Armed anarchists met them in the streets. The Republic did nothing. Nationalists were denied cabinet positions by the Republic, while a miners' strike in Asturias turns into a full-on uprising from the socialist parties in the state of Catalonia. The military, led by Francisco Franco, quells the revolt with blood. Landowners of large farmers and other industries clamped down on their laborers as cruel as possible. Heading into 1936, the various unions and societies of revolutionary workers united into their own party, the Popular Front. At the polls on February 16th, the Popular Front narrowly wins seats over SEDA. Some suspect the election is rigged. Confrontation on the streets is a common occurrence. The Nationalists claim the left-leaning Republicans bring nothing more than anarchy. The anarchists refuse to be permanently attached with the socialist parties. Revolution is on the mind of the Republicans, who fear the Nationalists preparing to stage a coup with the military. These fears are not wrong. On July 17th, national soldiers in Morocco took up arms and executed their Republican leaders. The following day, rebellions erupt throughout Spain. Republicans armed themselves and managed to delay much of the military uprising. The Spanish Civil War had begun. The Nationalists moved their Army of Africa to the mainland and fight their way to connect with other forces. Francisco Franco is appointed general and targets Madrid. Months bleed into years as the Republicans put up a stout defense the Nationalists did not plan for. The Nationalist rebels catches the attention of Nazi Germany, who agree along with Italy to support the upstart fascist nation, allowing Hitler to demonstrate the power of the Luftwaffe to the world. The Republicans find aid in the form of the Soviet Union, wanting to check fascism. But this alliance costs the Republicans direct aid from the rest of Europe and North America, unwilling to support communism and get tangled into a proxy war with Germany. Nevertheless, thousands volunteer from around the world to join the international brigades to fight on both sides of the conflict, predominantly on behalf of the Republicans. But infighting is constant among the various militant groups, famously with an anarchist revolt in Barcelona that forces Republican troops to be shifted into Catalonia. By 1938, the Nationalists turned their sights from Madrid toward these turbulent grounds in the east. A rapid offensive reaches the coast by summer, cutting the Republic in two. Those unable to break south to the temporary capital of Valencia dig in along the banks of the Ebro River. A blessing came to the Republicans in way of France temporarily reopening trade, bringing desperately needed food and weaponry. But in order to maintain lifelines like this, the Republic had to be reunited. Doing so would require a massive coordinated strike, pushing resources of the Republicans to their very breaking point. The Nationalist attention was drawn upon Valencia, whose defenders were holding out upon what became known as the XYZ line. Only a few divisions were left behind to defend the lower basin of the Ebro. It would be here that the Republicans would attempt to break out. With influence by Soviet advisors, the Republican High Command collaborated the strategy for their gamble. An initial crossing would establish bridgeheads on an 80-kilometer front. They would then move off into the initial heights and secure the various crossroads, moving as quickly west as they could. The task fell upon the newly formed Army of the Ebro, and an amalgamation of two army corps under the command of Juan Goito Leon, better known as Juan Modesto. His appointment was one of several given to various communist figures throughout 1938, making anarchist-leaning factions increasingly leery of the Republic. Modesto, however, brought with him a popular reputation of fighting experience in the Foreign Legion prior to the Civil War, as well as his decisions being swift and sometimes brutal. Modesto's Army of the Ebro would eventually have two additional army corps to pull from for reinforcements, bringing 80,000 troops to bear on the Republican side of the river. Unfortunately for Modesto, his command was supplied increasingly eroding artillery and had little to no air cover. Regardless of the drawbacks, Republican High Command issued the orders to attack on July 22nd. There would be no turning back. While the Italian Air Force had observed the Republican buildup throughout July, intelligence such as this was largely ignored by Franco and Nationalist High Command. More recent research indicates Franco purposely was keeping the bulk of his force concealed by the various rugged mountains. Nevertheless, the riverbanks were only defended by thin ranks of spotters of the 50th and 105th Divisions of the Moroccan Army Corps, occupying hastily constructed bunkers along the riverbank. Just past midnight on July 25th, the Republican attack commenced. Under cover of a moonless sky, hundreds of boats silently crossed the Ebro. The crossing parties aimed their landing sites away from strong points, planning to instead surround their initial targets from behind. The 226th Brigade, spearheaded by the 42nd Division, assaulted into the Ots, swinging south to take Fayon. Nationalists in this region scaled back into the mountain range and managed to keep the roadway running north under their control for over 24 hours following the landings. The 3rd Division aimed to cut off the Nationalists around Flix, which sat within a hairpin bend in the river, being delayed only by Nationalist artillery, which quickly retired deeper into the mountains. The 35th Division, comprising of the International Brigades, crossed from Venerbra so quickly they managed to capture a Nationalist colonel before he had the chance to relocate his headquarters. Further south, things were not going as well for the 5th Corps. While the 11th and 46th Divisions had managed to cross the Ebro, all crossings beyond Zerdo were pushed back. Republicans would later claim these movements were merely diversionary, that the main thrust was centered upon Ganesa. It nevertheless shrunk the hole punched into the Nationalists by half. Word quickly reached the commander of the Nationalist Army, Fidel Davila, and Franco himself, and several divisions were quickly mobilized and rushed to the Ebro front. Some units, however, were being called from as far away from the other side of the country and would take a few days to arrive en masse. In the meantime, orders were given at 11 a.m. to open up the Barsona Reservoir to flood the Ebro. Nationalist Allied aircraft was on the scene by midday, including newly constructed Stukas of the Luftwaffe. They quickly began bombing the temporary cork footbridges the first wave had established, severing communications and supply lines, but only temporarily. The engineers were already hard at work on establishing permanent iron bridges at places such as Flix, able to partially withstand some of the bombing runs. By nightfall, the 35th Division had moved into the valley between the Cavals and Fatar Ellis, as far west as Corbera. The 3rd Division had secured parts of the foothills of the Fatar Ellis and threatened Vilba de los Arcs. The 11th and 46th Divisions had pushed their Nationalist opponents deep into the Pandols and awaited reinforcements to continue the job. However, the armor of the 16th Division was not allowed to cross this first day, per reverse decisions by Republican High Command. This would have a grave impact on future operations, as Nationalist armor with several additional divisions were speeding toward Gandesa and Fatar Ellis. The community of Gandesa was renowned for its various wineries in the surrounding hills. War was brought to the county seat of Terra Alta in April of 1938 as the 15th International Brigade used the town to delay the Nationalist advance into Catalonia. Now the residents of Gandesa found themselves under Nationalist occupation, with civilians being pulled into the workforce to barricade every passage into town. The major roadway running north to south between Vilba de Arcos into the Pandols had become the new defensive line, with the shattered remains of the 50th Division ordered to hold out at all costs. The Republican assault begins on the 26th of July, initially moving down from the La Fatarellas and attempting to secure the eastern side of the Villalba. But without any tank support, they are pinned within a cemetery that's open to Nationalist machine gun nests lining every window upon the road. The assault on Gandesa is marred with delays, and the International Brigades were not able to move until 4 p.m., and even with their newly arrived armor divisions, they were unable to pierce the defenses around the town. The attacks resumed on the 27th. The focus shifts upon a hill to the east of town named Pogue de Alga, known militarily as Hill 481. Whoever held this hill would have the dominated view of the surrounding area. The Republican 15th International Brigade originally occupied it, with British volunteers comedically dubbing it the Pimple. But after the 6th Bandera managed to overtake the heights, the destructive counterattacks by the Republicans fittingly named it Death Hill. By July 30th, little was being gained with the isolated attacks. Modesto ordered for an assault across the entire front, beginning on August 1st. While elements of the 11th Division managed to secure new footholds within the Pandols, the 16th and 35th Divisions were unable to break through Gandesa. Modesto broke off the assault, allowing for the opposing sides to settle into their lines, with Nationalist aircraft bombarding the deplorable Republican artillery. August rolled in with only the murmurs of dueling artillery. The Nationalists had been shaken by the swift push from the Ebro River, but had managed to stall this new offensive within the treacherous mountain ranges of southwestern Catalonia and Aragon. The Republicans had managed to save Valencia for the time being, but that meant that the very might of Franco's Nationalist forces were now steamrolling north to flatten the dent punched in their lines. The 5th Corps of the Ebro Army were under command of Enrique Lister. Although his impulsive nature had cost him a multitude of careers prior to the war, he was unwilling to give ground to the enemy, no matter the cost of the defense. His men entrenched within the Pandols, a mountain range of steep peaks cresting 600 meters, deep caves for cover, and sheer cliffs making it a nightmare for any assaulting force. Still needing time to formulate a strategy to take the Pandols, the Nationalist command instead set their sights upon the right flank of the Republican line. The 42nd Division were isolated from the remainder of the army, sitting within the Otz Mountains north of the village of Fayon. Tank groups that included recently arrived Panzer Is and captured T-26 rolled into the Otz with the 82nd Division. By August 7th, they had quickly secured this mountain range. The 42nd quickly retreated back across the Ebro, leaving nearly 2,000 of their number stranded. Over 800 were slaughtered, with the remaining 1,000 taken prisoners along with their rifles, machine guns, and armor. Republican High Command later claimed the Fayon pocket was yet another distraction meant to buy time for Lister's defense. The Nationalists hoped to bypass the Pandols' defense altogether, instead trying to carve a road to connect the southern and central sectors together. But Republican artillery, obscured by the peaks around the Santa Magdalena Hermitage, checked their progress. The Nationalists responded early on August 10th with 24 batteries of artillery that concentrated on hills 671, 698, 705, and 666. The initial strikes toward Hill 698 were viciously repulsed by the timely arrival of companies from the 9th Mixed Brigade. It would not be until August 11th that the Flanders Battalion secured the peak, and now had to fight across swells of the terrain toward Hills 671 and 705. It's believed that over half of the final casualties reported by the 4th Nationalist Division were accumulated in the fight over these two peaks. The defenders of the heights suffered even worse, as hundreds of bodies were later reported being left behind. At last, on August 14th, the Republicans begrudgingly conceded Hill 705 to the Nationalists, with Hill 698 being vacated shortly thereafter. The 4th Division were fatigued and unable to take Hill 666, which was now being occupied by the 35th Division. It would not be until mid-August that figures from the Nationalist High Command were at last in direct view of the battlefield, with General Davila arriving to take over command of the Army of the North. It was clear to him that the Pandols were at this point nearly impossible to completely break through, and shifted priority to striking the Republican right flank and the Fortalezas. Here, the Republicans had quickly carved out an intricate network of trenches that were in some cases only throwing distance away. Looking over the headlogs, the Nationalists could see a tight nest of machine guns protected by thick beams and earthworks dug out in the vicinity known as Tarraga. It was all necessary in order to maintain control over the vital crossroads in the area that led from the mountains toward Gandesa. This frontal assault called for the use of resources from 3 different divisions. Prior to the planned attack, the Nationalists busted open more floodgates to swell the Ebro. Nationalist aircraft managed to destroy 3 of the bridges. Over 40 Nationalist batteries opened fire upon the Fortalezas at noon on August 19th. The 74th Division stepped off toward the trenches, with the 82nd and 13th Divisions providing support. Anti-tank guns neutralized much of the Nationalist armor. Machine guns in the foothills cut down the initial waves. But by 2 p.m. on the following day, the Tarraga nest had been overran, reopening the critical corridor from the Villalba to Gandesa to Zerda. The 27th Republican Division rushed to provide aid to the 60th, hastily trying to carve out new positions in the dominating peak known as La Gaeta. The ground here could only be dug down a few meters. Only small growth provided cover for either side. For 3 days, the Republicans poured a non-stop blades on the Nationalists scaling the side of the hill. It would not be until the 22nd of August that the rebels secured La Gaeta, but only budged their lines forward by 3 kilometers. Once more, the advance stalled. The Republican defenses restabilized deeper in the mountains. Although La Gaeta gave the Nationalists their foothold back upon the Fortalezas, the road ahead traversed multiple deep swells and valleys. The region reminded some Italian advisors of the horrors of the treacherous ground on the Isonzo front during the Great War. Before any new assault could be made, the Nationalist Army of the North had to be reorganized. Divisions were exchanged to form the May-Strasgo Corps, while the Moroccan Corps had their ranks tightened to the north. Nationalist High Command wished to strike on all fronts with as much firepower as they could muster. The Moroccan Corps would renew the assault toward La Fortaleza, while the May-Strasgo Corps hoped to dislodge the Republican 5th Corps, which still held out in much of the Pandols after numerous bloody assaults. The 2 corps' priorities were divided by the road running to the community of Camposines. On September 3rd, some 350 pieces of artillery poured hell upon the Republican line. The advance off of La Gaeta toward the next line of hilltops was devastating for both sides. The 27th Division dug in their heels, trying desperately to keep the right flank from coming back toward the river. Seeing the 27th melt away from continual fire, Modesto ordered for the 11th International Brigade to break off to secure the flank. The 16th Division were also shipped the 12th International Brigade, plugging a hole left behind when several units were dispatched north to try and retake Fayon. This left the 35th Division weakened, forced to give up Corbera by the 5th of September. The 1st Division rode high on a new wave of morale and veered off the road to attempt and destroy the 35th Division. Over 20 tanks were hurried into the valley, pounding the flanks of the Nationalists attempting to storm the heights of the Cabals. The fighting here peaked by September 11th, being called an inferno of fire and explosions. The diversion into the Cabals had formed a salient in the Nationalist line, which Modesto ordered to be attacked at all costs. Elements of the 13th and 82nd Divisions were rushed into the salient, trying to push toward Camposines. If the crossroads there could be controlled, the Army of the Ebro would be split in 2. It took over a week for the Nationalists to crawl their way up the valley, being harassed from both sides. Losses continued to soar, with at least 2 of the most experienced commanders from the Tabar battalions being killed in action. By September 20th, they had yet to take Camposines, but had the knowledge they had dealt enough punishment to destroy much of the ranks of the prized international brigades. While the Nationalists tore apart the Republicans from the front, international politics carved out their spine. A crisis had grown, centered upon Czechoslovakia, the next country within the crosshairs of Hitler's expansion of the Third Reich. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain worked continually with the hope he would stop the expansion of fascism through peaceful legislature. This became known as the Munich Agreement, concluded on the 30th of September. Hitler was allowed to annex a portion of Czechoslovakia in exchange for being its final territorial claim. A byproduct of these negotiations involved pulling foreign volunteers on both sides out of Spain. The Republicans had removed their international brigades from the front lines. So by the time they were pulled from the Ebro front, there was little left of their original ranks. The Republic hoped that this offensive would bring in further aid had disintegrated. September 23rd marked the last day for the international brigades on the front line. A day so desperate the soldiers were forced to stave off the encroaching nationalist armor with just grenades and Molotov cocktails. On October 4th, elements of the 1st and 13th Divisions crept into Camposines. The Republican center was now being pressed to implode. The Nationalist artillery and aircraft never eased up on delivering round after round of explosives into the mountains, where the Republicans still held out. A day longer they managed to hold the Rocky Peaks, a day longer the Republic lived on. Franco had come to realize just how defiant his adversary was, and wanted to annihilate them once and for all. During a meeting on October 23rd, the plan for the annihilation of the Republic was laid out. Several nationalist divisions would push with all their might toward Asco, while the assaults upon the mountains were renewed. Once at Asco, the nationalists would fan out and attack what Republican troops remained in the mountains, surrounding and destroying the army of the Ebro. Like all previous counterattacks, it began with an artillery bombardment. On October 30th, over 9,000 tons of artillery shells were fired into the Cavals. National aircraft swooped in, dropping another 8,000 tons of bombs. Unlike the previous disorganized pushes into the mountains, the 1st Division opted instead for small, tight columns. It was this combination of relentless artillery, bombing, and swift infantry advances that at last captured much of the Cavals by November 3rd. By similar time, the Republicans lost Hill 666. Like a lake pouring out of a broken dam, the entire 5th Corps caved in without hesitation. The 74th Division snatched away any route of counterattack by capturing Panel and defending the crossroads with tanks. The 11th and 43rd Divisions had no choice but begin to retreat back across the Ebro. Even against these insurmountable odds, the Republican right flank was still managing to buy time for the rest of the army to regroup. But by November 11th, Republican High Command knew there was no chance of remaining on the Ebro front. Their artillery had already been sent back across the river, and now it was time to evacuate as many soldiers as they could. The 42nd and 44th Divisions managed to perform a defiant rearguard action for 2 days around Asco, allowing much of the surviving army to pull across the bridges further north in an orderly manner. A fog rolled in during the final days of the battle, further aiding the retreat. The remains of the 35th Division were the last across the bridge in the early morning of November 16th. The bridge were blown up by day's end. After nearly 4 months of fighting, the largest battle of the Spanish Civil War was finally over. The Republicans had gambled and lost. Their chances to turn the tide were gone. But Franco had also failed in his aims of entire annihilation of the Republic's army. The battle lines returned to where they had been in late July, this time with far fewer numbers. The Butcher's Bill has been debated by soldiers, commanders, journalists, and historians. It's most likely that over 5,000 nationalists were killed, with 35,000 wounded, missing, or captured. The Republicans had suffered far worse, with anywhere from 7,000 to 15,000 killed, or somewhere around 40,000 wounded, missing, or captured. The offensive also led to the Republic losing highly valuable equipment. Some 18 Soviet tanks were captured, with another 17 destroyed, as well as much of the artillery used by Modesto's army being destroyed beyond repair. The Battle of the Ebro had indeed managed to stop Franco's national Spain, but only by a few months. The offensive had strained the resources of the Republic to their limit. They had little strength to stop the nationalist offensive into Catalonia, with Barcelona falling on January 26, 1939. The United Kingdom and France recognized Franco's regime shortly thereafter. The final days of the Republic were just like the first, with various factions pulling the strings of the nation thinner and thinner until nothing remained. Believing the Republic had grown increasingly communistic and realizing there was no chances of stopping Franco, the existing government was overthrown by the National Defense Council, a committee representing the labor unions, the socialists, the anarchists, and other groups. A civil war within a civil war erupted, with the council's hope of surrendering to the rebels and return to their life as it had been before. The Republic did nothing.